Prince Harry has exposed a secret deal between King Charles and Camilla, one that involved leaking private stories about him to protect Camilla's image. The betrayal runs deep, and now the king is facing public humiliation. This isn't just family drama, it's a royal scandal shaking the monarchy from the inside. The Hidden Pact. What Prince Harry claims exists. Prince Harry didn't just release a memoir, he set the palace on fire. In Spare, he revealed a secret understanding between King Charles and Queen Camilla that most people had only whispered about until now. According to Harry, Camilla made a deal with the press, one that would reshape her public image, but at the deep expense of others in the family. Most notably, Harry himself. He claimed Camilla worked behind the scenes to leak personal details about him, including his drug use, rehab experiences, and private family conversations, all to appear more favorable in the eyes of the British public. The goal was to transform her from the other woman into a respectable queen consort, and she was willing to trade anything to get there, including the trust of her own stepson. She was dangerous, Harry wrote, because of the connections she was forging with the British press. According to him, this wasn't just calculated, it was ruthless. The worst part? Charles allegedly allowed it to happen. It was a personal betrayal, one that felt even deeper coming from his father. Instead of protecting his son, Harry believes Charles chose to protect Camilla's public image, possibly believing that a polished narrative would strengthen the monarchy. But to Harry, that decision destroyed any remaining trust between them. This wasn't just another tabloid scandal, it was the beginning of a full royal fracture. But this rift didn't happen overnight. It started years earlier, when Harry and William saw the writing on the wall and tried to stop it before it began. When the prince pleaded, early warnings ignored. Years before the public accepted Camilla as queen, Harry and William tried to prevent it from ever happening. Behind palace doors, the brothers reportedly came to their father with a heartfelt plea: do not marry her. According to Spare and multiple reports, they weren't opposed to Camilla being in Charles's life. They just feared what a public marriage would trigger. The media, already obsessed with her image, would twist everything, and the family would be thrown into chaos. They begged him not to do it, an insider told People. But Charles didn't listen. In Harry's eyes, Charles was blinded by duty or maybe love, unwilling to consider the emotional toll it would take on his sons. It wasn't about bitterness, it was about survival. They had already lived through the trauma of Diana's death and the years of media harassment. The idea of officially placing Camilla in the center of royal life felt like reopening a barely healed wound. But Charles made his choice. He moved forward with Camilla, pushing aside their concerns. And with that, a line was drawn. Legacy over loyalty. Image over intimacy. Looking back, Harry saw this moment as the turning point. The warnings he and William gave weren't just ignored, they were buried. And over time, the press's obsession with Camilla only grew. Stories about her softened. Meanwhile, Harry's reputation took hit after hit. Coincidence? Or part of a strategy? By the time Harry sat down to write Spare, he wasn't just telling stories. He was building a case. And the next chapter of that case exposed the deal in full detail. Names, incidents, and a level of truth that left Buckingham Palace scrambling. The deal, exposed through Spare. When Spare was released, it wasn't just a memoir, it was a declaration of war. For the first time, Prince Harry didn't hold back. He laid everything out, raw, personal, and deeply damaging to the royal image. But no revelation stung more than the alleged deal between Camilla and the press. In Harry's words, It wasn't just about bad press or occasional leaks. It was a calculated operation. He described how Camilla, over the years, had carefully built relationships with journalists, offering them just enough behind-the-scenes information to keep herself in their good books. And the cost? His life being put on public display, one scandal at a time. He wrote about how he became the sacrificial lamb, used to draw attention away from Camilla's troubled past. One of the most painful examples? Stories about his teenage drug use and stint in rehab. According to Harry, these weren't random tabloid rumors. They were planted, not to harm him directly, but to make Charles look like a caring, involved father, and Camilla like a reformed, steady influence. The press loved it. Camilla's reputation quietly improved. She was no longer the mistress, she was the stabilizer. And meanwhile, Harry's image unraveled in front of millions. Inside the palace, the reaction to Spare was one of complete shock. According to insiders, there was no preparation for the level of detail Harry would go into, or how openly he would call out Camilla. Even some of the most experienced royal aides were stunned at how directly he blamed her for orchestrating his media downfall. But Harry didn't care about protocol anymore. For him, this wasn't about revenge, it was about telling his truth. He felt the damage done to him was deliberate, pre-approved, and worst of all, permitted by his father. And when the world read those pages, something shifted. Public opinion was no longer black and white. It wasn't just Harry versus the royals. It became, how far were Charles and Camilla really willing to go to control the narrative? This question didn't stay in whispers. It exploded across news channels and social media. And suddenly, all eyes turned to one group that had quietly played a role in this storm all along: the British press. The media's role, from whisper to roar. The relationship between the British royal family and the media has always been complex. But after Harry's revelations, that tangled web became impossible to ignore. The press wasn't just reporting on the royals. They were in the room, influencing decisions, protecting some figures while tearing others down. For years, Camilla had been a tabloid villain, blamed for Diana's misery and publicly shamed. But then, something shifted. Articles about her softened. Headlines began to frame her as regal, loyal, and even misunderstood. And almost every time her image improved, Harry's image worsened. In Spare, Harry made it clear, this wasn't a coincidence. He accused Camilla of trading personal information to gain favor. Stories were leaked, whispered, or subtly placed to shift public attention, making her look better while others, especially him, took the fall. He even hinted that the palace had an unofficial media strategy: throw Harry to the wolves if it meant protecting the future queen. Certain members had a need to rehabilitate their image, he wrote, and that came at the cost of people close to them. The timing of all this couldn't have been more explosive. Charles was already battling health concerns, trying to stabilize his early reign. The press was still spinning from Spare and the Netflix documentary. And now, the idea that the monarchy had essentially made a deal with the press behind closed doors had become a mainstream conversation. Some journalists began to dig deeper. Others doubled down in defense of the crown. But public trust? That started to crack wide open. People wondered how much of what they'd read about Harry over the years was planted. How many of Camilla's glowing articles were paid for not in money, but in betrayal? What once seemed like gossip became a royal PR scandal. And at the center of it all was King Charles, a man who, whether by action or silence, allowed this game to continue. But this wasn't just a media manipulation story. It was a story about power, about sacrifice, and about the people the monarchy is willing to silence to survive. And as the headlines spun faster, the question became painfully clear. Was Camilla orchestrating all of this alone? Or did Charles know exactly what was happening? Camilla's position: strategist or scapegoat? Once Prince Harry exposed the so-called deal, attention quickly turned to Camilla. Was she really the mastermind behind it all? Or had she become a convenient scapegoat for a deeper problem inside the royal institution? For decades, Camilla was portrayed as the woman who broke up Charles and Diana, the other woman the public refused to forgive. But somewhere along the way, that image changed. She went from being the most hated woman in Britain to a royal figure accepted, even embraced, by some of the press. That didn't happen by accident. Harry's words painted a clear picture. Camilla had worked the long game. She built strong relationships with media editors, allegedly traded stories, and slowly rewrote her narrative. Dangerous, he called her, not because of who she was, but because of what she was willing to do to secure her future. Still, many questioned whether Camilla acted alone. Was she simply protecting herself in a brutal system that demanded loyalty or invisibility? Or was she pulling strings, using the media as a tool, while Charles stood quietly by her side? Inside the palace, things were far more complicated. Some insiders suggested Camilla had Charles's full support in her image rehabilitation. Others hinted she operated independently, crafting her own path and leaving even the king slightly behind in strategy. Either way, the result was the same. Camilla's public approval grew, while Harry's and Meghan's reputations sank. Outside the royal gates, the public was divided. Some saw Camilla as a tactical genius, finally taking control of a life she had been shamed for. Others saw her as the architect of betrayal, someone who climbed the ladder by stepping over those closest to her. But the real damage wasn't just to Harry. It was to Charles's credibility. Because whether Camilla acted on her own or with his knowledge, the fallout now rested squarely on the king's shoulders. And that leads to the next question. How does a monarch handle scandal, broken trust, and worldwide humiliation all at once? Charles's crisis: trust, legacy, and reputation. The moment Harry's book hit the shelves, King Charles faced the most personal and public crisis of his reign. Not just as a father, but as a monarch whose every move is now under the microscope. For years, Charles worked to shift public opinion. After Diana's death, his reputation was at an all-time low. The slow, careful rebranding of both himself and Camilla took decades. But in one book and a few devastating interviews, Harry brought all that work crashing down. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a global royal scandal. And Charles, caught in the middle, appeared powerless to stop the narrative. What made this even more damaging was the core accusation that he allowed Camilla to trade on his son's pain to improve their public image. If true, it didn't just make him look weak, it made him look complicit. A father willing to sacrifice his son's privacy to protect a crown he had waited his whole life to wear. Behind the scenes, palace sources spoke of panic. Advisors debated whether Charles should speak publicly or stay silent. Some urged him to respond with dignity and restraint. Others worried silence would be seen as guilt. But Charles, a man trained in the old ways of royal behavior, chose the latter: silence. That silence, however, only fueled speculation. Headlines called him cold, aloof, even humiliated. Every photo was analyzed, every event scrutinized. And through it all, the question remained: Was this the image of a modern king, or the crumbling of one? For Charles, the personal cost was steep. Not just the media storm, but the emotional toll of losing his youngest son to bitterness and exile. The weight of that rift, especially when laid bare in Harry's own voice, was heavy. And for a man who had spent decades preparing for kingship, this was not the legacy he imagined. And while Charles may hope the noise dies down, this isn't just a chapter in a book. It's a turning point in the story of the monarchy, one that the world is watching closely. Royal fallout, family ties torn. Behind the palace walls, the damage was no longer just reputational. It was deeply personal. Prince Harry's revelations didn't just expose a deal or a media strategy. They blew apart whatever remained of the royal family's fragile unity. And when the dust began to settle, it was clear. The once unbreakable ties between father and sons, brothers and wives, had been shattered beyond recognition. At the center of it all stood Charles, a king torn between his crown and his children. The heartbreak was undeniable. Harry, once the beloved spare, now stood on the outside looking in. He had crossed a line not just by speaking out, but by naming names, breaking silence, and challenging the very fabric of monarchy. And what of William? Harry's older brother, his closest companion through the worst years of their childhood, was noticeably silent. While the public hoped for reconciliation, insiders hinted at something colder, a deep sense of betrayal. William was furious, not just at the content of Harry's memoir, but at the fact that it aired their private grief on a global stage. Then there was the ripple effect. Kate and Meghan, once held up as modern faces of the monarchy, were now pulled into the storm. Public comparisons intensified. Supporters of one duchess turned against the other. Every smile, every absence, every awkward glance was dissected online. Even Camilla, now queen consort, found herself recast as a central villain, dragged back into the Diana-era narratives she had spent years escaping. Meanwhile, the monarchy's carefully maintained image, duty, loyalty, tradition, began to crack under the pressure. For a family meant to symbolize national unity, the rift became a symbol of something else. A family divided, both emotionally and ideologically. Internationally, the impact was just as sharp. American audiences largely sympathized with Harry and Meghan, but in the UK, opinion was split. Some stood by the crown, others began to question its integrity. News networks, talk shows, and social media exploded with debate. Was this a royal crisis or a long overdue reckoning? But while the world debated, the family remained frozen, unable or unwilling to bridge the gap. No apology, no reconciliation, no sign of progress, only more silence. And as the palace tried to carry on with business as usual, smiling walkabouts, charity visits, carefully curated photo ops, the public couldn't help but notice what was missing. A family that once stood side by side in grief now stood miles apart, both physically and emotionally. And with each passing day, the question grew louder. Can the royal family survive this deep of a divide? Or has Harry's truth-telling changed their image forever? Public reaction, sympathy, scandal, or skepticism? Outside palace gates, the British public and the world had its own reckoning to deal with. Because as Prince Harry's story spread like wildfire, people were forced to choose sides. Was this a brave act of truth-telling from a man who had suffered in silence for years? Or a bitter attack on a family trying to heal? In many ways, the reaction was unprecedented. Polls showed a deep generational divide. Older royalists held tightly to the institution, while younger generations leaned toward Harry's side, viewing him not as a rebel, but as a survivor of a toxic system. And globally? Sympathy for Harry and Meghan soared, especially in the US, where their Netflix series and interviews found a more open audience. Social media turned into a battlefield. Viral clips of Harry's interviews circulated everywhere. Camilla, once rebranded as a respectable queen, was suddenly back under fire. Memes, threads, and online discussions painted her as the cold, calculating player Harry had described. The hashtag Queen of Leaks trended for days. Even respected journalists and public figures chimed in. Some defended Charles, calling Harry's decision to publish Spare disrespectful and self-serving. Others said it was long overdue, a powerful man finally speaking against a system that expected silence and obedience. Tabloids, of course, feasted on the drama. But unlike previous years, their coverage was more cautious. With the Sussexes winning legal battles and exposing press manipulation, the usual anti-Harry narrative didn't land as easily. For once, the public wasn't just consuming gossip, they were questioning it. And all of this left the monarchy walking a tightrope. Their greatest strength has always been stability and control. But now their story wasn't theirs anymore. Harry had taken control of the narrative, and millions were listening. Behind the scenes, Buckingham Palace was watching the numbers. Approval ratings, public opinion, social trust. Everything was being monitored, because they knew, in the age of viral outrage and global media, perception is power. And once it slips, it's nearly impossible to take back. Now, with the world divided and trust fractured, the royal family stands at a crossroads. Do they respond, risking even more exposure? Or do they stay silent and hope people forget? Either choice comes with a price. But one thing is clear. The monarchy's biggest threat may no longer be scandal. It's losing the people. Charles's possible responses and damage control. In the face of growing pressure, King Charles found himself at a crossroads, and every possible move came with consequences. Harry's revelations didn't just dent the monarchy's image, they pierced the very idea of what royal leadership is supposed to be. Now, with his own son painting him as a complicit, distant father, Charles was left with two options: fight back or fade quietly into the background. But how do you respond when your son accuses your wife of betrayal and blames you for allowing it? So far, Charles has chosen silence. The palace issued no formal rebuttal to Spare, and the king has made no personal statement. But behind the scenes, insiders say the crisis team went into full damage control mode. Meetings were called, strategy sessions ramped up. Everything from public appearances to social media interactions was suddenly micromanaged. The goal was clear: restore control without feeding the fire. Still, the longer the silence stretched, the louder the questions became. One path Charles could take is reconciliation, reaching out privately to Harry, not just as a father, but as a king trying to heal his broken legacy. That kind of move could change the entire narrative, but many believe it's unlikely. Too much has been said, too much trust lost. And Charles, famously known for avoiding confrontation, may simply not have the stomach for such a raw, emotional battle. Another option: redirect public attention. The palace has leaned into Charles's ongoing health battles, charity work, and royal duties. Every appearance is now part of the strategy. Show strength, show leadership, and most importantly, show the world that the monarchy still functions with or without Harry. Camilla's team has also gone into high gear, carefully curating her appearances and avoiding any hint of controversy. But the whispers remain. Can her image truly recover when so many now see her as the shadowy figure behind Harry's fall? Internally, there's also talk of tightening press protocols, revisiting how leaks are handled, who has access to information, and how royal communications are filtered. Ironically, Harry's accusations have forced the palace to rethink the very tactics he accused them of using. But even with all these efforts, one uncomfortable truth remains. Charles is now fighting two battles, one to protect the monarchy and one to protect his personal reputation as a father, husband, and man. And the longer Harry's words echo, the harder it becomes to fix either. So what happens if Charles does nothing? What if the silence continues? What if the firm simply waits for the world to move on? That brings us to the final, and perhaps most important, question of all. The stakes ahead: monarchy, truth, and redemption. This isn't just a scandal, it's a defining moment. Because what Prince Harry exposed wasn't just a family secret, it was a glimpse behind the golden curtain of monarchy itself. Now, the institution stands at a tipping point, and the decisions made in the coming months may shape its future for generations to come. For King Charles, this is about more than headlines. It's about legacy. He waited decades for the crown. But just as it landed on his head, the story changed. No longer the patient prince. He's now a controversial king, caught in a very public reckoning. Not just with his son, but with the people watching. If Charles hopes to lead into a new era, he must decide: cling to tradition or embrace uncomfortable truths. That might mean facing his own role in the pain Harry describes. It might mean choosing transparency over silence. But without real action, the trust that's been lost, both in him and in the monarchy, may never return. For Harry, the stakes are just as personal. Speaking out came at a cost: estrangement, criticism, even ridicule. But it also gave him freedom. His truth is out, and he doesn't seem interested in crawling back. The question now is whether that truth creates change or just burns bridges. Is there a path back for father and son? Can the royal family heal without losing face? Or has this story already gone too far for redemption? And what about the monarchy itself? With younger generations questioning its relevance and scandals stacking faster than titles, can the institution survive a world that now demands honesty over heritage? One thing is certain: the age of quiet dignity is over. The royals can no longer hide behind palace gates and expect loyalty. Not when the people want answers. Not when a prince holds a microphone. The crown still sits on Charles's head, but for how long? And at what cost? Because in this new royal chapter, truth isn't just powerful, it's revolutionary. The truth is out, and the crown may never look the same. With Camilla under fire and Charles facing backlash, this royal storm is far from over. Will the monarchy survive the fallout? Or will Harry's revelations rewrite history? Subscribe and stay tuned, because in this royal saga, the drama has only just begun.